She had never thought of herself as important, at least not in the ways the world often measured importance. She dressed simply, spoke softly, and moved through life with a quiet grace that made people feel comfortable around her. Today, however, she found herself in an environment that was anything but simple. The terminal was buzzing with the low hum of travelers, the beeping of luggage scanners, and the occasional announcement echoing through the cavernous space. She clutched her ticket tightly in her hand, double-checking the seat number 1 last time before heading to the counter. Her heart had fluttered with excitement all morning. Traveling first class was not something she did often, not because she didn't want to, but because she preferred to stay out of the spotlight. It felt like a luxury reserved for others, people who wore the world's attention like a cloak. But today was different, and she had promised herself to enjoy it quietly without fuss. The agent at the counter gave her a quick, distracted glance as she handed over her ticket. He typed something into his computer and looked back up, frowning slightly. "Ma'am, it looks like there's been a little mix-up. Your seat isn't available in first class. We're overbooked, so we'll have to move you to economy." Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment she felt a flush creeping up her neck. She had rehearsed a polite smile, a calm response, but nothing had prepared her for the sudden sting of embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but my ticket says first class." The agent gave her a tight, apologetic smile and shook his head. "I know, ma'am. There's nothing I can do right now. Economy is the only option available." She nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in her throat. It wasn't just the seat. It was the feeling of being misplaced, of being seen as someone less than she was, at least in the eyes of strangers. She gathered her carry-on and followed the staff towards the economy cabin, keeping her steps measured and her expression calm. She refused to let frustration take control, even as her heart thudded painfully against her chest. As she walked through the aisle, she noticed the looks from other passengers. Some stared openly, curiosity or judgment flickering across their faces. Others pretended not to notice, but she could sense the subtle whispers, the sideways glances. She felt exposed, as if she were on display, her dignity hanging in the balance. And yet, she forced herself to breathe slowly, reminding herself that her worth was not tied to a seat or a class of travel. Finding her place among the rows of seats in the economy section, she tried to settle in as gracefully as she could. She buckled her seatbelt, arranged her bag at her feet, and offered a polite smile to the woman sitting next to her. The woman returned a hesitant nod, and for a moment the tension eased slightly. Small gestures of human kindness, she thought, could make the most uncomfortable situations bearable. The flight attendants were rushing past, attending to passengers and making announcements. She noticed a young man struggling with a stroller and a baby, a mother trying to calm a restless child, and an elderly gentleman adjusting his oxygen mask. Life, she realized, carried on regardless of social status or ticket class. Everyone had their challenges, their discomforts, their moments of vulnerability. She tried to focus on that, letting herself watch the ordinary chaos of the cabin. She admired the patience of the crew, their constant attempts to keep everyone satisfied. A soft smile appeared on her lips, and she felt a small sense of peace amidst the embarrassment. It was a strange contrast, the world treating her one way while she quietly reminded herself of her own inner steadiness. As the plane taxied down the runway, she thought about the irony of the situation. She had entered the first-class lounge moments ago, expecting comfort, exclusivity, perhaps even a sense of recognition. Now she sat here among strangers, humbled by circumstance. Yet there was a strange comfort in this humility. It reminded her of who she was, of the life she lived outside these walls of luxury. She had never sought wealth or attention for herself, and perhaps that was why she could sit here without anger, without resentment. The flight took off smoothly, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. She gazed out of the window, watching the city shrink beneath her. The view was beautiful, indifferent to her social position, indifferent to the mix-up at the counter. It was a quiet reminder that the world moved on, that life continued beyond small humiliations and mistaken identities. As the seatbelt signs blinked off, passengers began settling in, some chatting quietly, others burying themselves in books or electronic devices. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Writing had always been her solace, a private space where she could think, reflect, and make sense of the world around her. She began jotting down thoughts, her pen moving steadily across the paper, each word grounding her in calmness. A flight attendant approached, offering drinks and snacks. She declined politely, feeling that part of the experience was learning to accept what was given without complaint. There was a strength in patience, she reminded herself, a dignity in quiet endurance. And yet in the back of her mind she knew this moment was not the end. Life had a way of turning unexpected situations into stories worth telling. Her mind wandered, imagining the reactions if anyone knew who she truly was. It was a secret she carried lightly, a part of her life that remained private. No one on this plane knew that her husband owned the very airline she now flew with. No one knew that the luxury she had been denied was not beyond her reach but simply irrelevant to the person she had chosen to be. It was amusing, in a subtle, private way, to think of the irony. Passengers around her seemed to settle into their journeys, each wrapped in their own worlds. She noticed the elderly couple sharing a small bag of peanuts, smiling at one another over trivial conversation. She saw the young traveler staring nervously at the safety instructions, fidgeting with their hands. She observed a man dozing with a book slipping from his lap. Each human moment, ordinary and unremarkable, was quietly fascinating to her. Hours passed and the meal service began. She declined again, though politely, and instead sipped on water. She didn't need the trappings of first class to feel a sense of dignity. She had learned long ago that self-respect wasn't measured by comfort or luxury, but by the ability to remain composed and kind, even when the world didn't seem to notice. Throughout the flight, she maintained a calm presence. Passengers occasionally glanced at her, noting her quiet composure. Some whispered to each other, assuming she was simply another passenger who had made a mistake. She smiled faintly at their assumptions, letting them remain in their world of appearances. Reality, she knew, was far richer and more nuanced than what could be observed in passing glances. As the plane began its descent, she straightened her seat, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. She had navigated an uncomfortable and embarrassing situation with grace, holding on to her inner calm even when the world seemed to misunderstand her. The landing was smooth, and the plane taxied to the gate without incident. Passengers gathered their belongings, chatting quietly as the engines wound down. She stood, lifted her bag from beneath the seat, and walked down the aisle slowly, allowing others to move ahead of her. She felt no rush, no sense of indignation. The experience, though uncomfortable at first, had been a lesson in humility, patience, and the quiet strength of self-possession. She knew that the story of this flight would remain with her, a private reminder that dignity was something she carried within herself, untouchable by circumstances or misunderstandings. Stepping off the plane, she felt a sense of relief mixed with quiet amusement. Life had a way of humbling even the smallest expectations, but it also had a way of revealing character. She had chosen her response, and in that choice she had found a measure of freedom. She walked through the terminal with calm confidence, her head held high, ready to continue her journey, unbothered by the brief moment of misunderstanding that had brought a hint of chaos into her otherwise simple life. The flight continued, and she remained in her seat, trying to make herself comfortable in the middle of a cabin that felt too crowded and noisy. She adjusted her bag, straightened her posture, and looked around. Passengers were settling in, some chatting quietly, some staring at their screens, some asleep already. There was a certain rhythm to it all, a rhythm she had noticed before but never truly appreciated until now. She noticed the small details, the way the flight attendant moved quickly but gracefully down the aisle, the way a mother held her child tightly while trying to read a story, the man a few rows ahead who hummed softly to himself as he worked on a laptop. The woman sitting next to her had started whispering to the person across the aisle. They were glancing in her direction from time to time. She tried not to notice, though the awareness of their subtle scrutiny made her feel slightly uncomfortable. She reminded herself that appearances could be deceiving. People often assumed things about others without knowing the full story. Today, she was living proof of that. The ticket in her hand had placed her in first class legally, yet here she was in economy, treated like just another passenger. She took a deep breath and returned to her notebook, scribbling down a few lines about the irony of life and the strange twists that could happen even in everyday situations. Her thoughts were interrupted when the young flight attendant came over to check on her. "Is everything okay, ma'am? Can I get you anything?" she asked politely. She smiled, appreciating the care, and shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." The attendant nodded and moved on, her steps light as she balanced a tray in her hands. It struck her how even in situations where people could be impatient or rude, There were those who carried kindness and patience in their work. That quiet humanity was something she had always admired. As the hours went by, small incidents kept reminding her of the reality of being in economy. She witnessed a man fumble with his tray, spilling juice across his seat and onto the floor. The flight attendants came quickly, cleaning it up with calm efficiency. A young boy a few rows ahead started crying because he had dropped his toy, and the mother tried to soothe him while keeping her own frustration in check. She watched, empathetic, realizing that the small challenges of life were often the ones that revealed people's character most clearly. A sense of humility washed over her. In the moment she had been removed from first class, she had felt embarrassed, almost invisible. But now, seeing how people struggled, helped, and adjusted around her, she felt a strange connection to everyone on that plane. They were all human, all dealing with discomfort, small annoyances, and little triumphs. She understood that dignity was not something given by status, ticket class, or wealth. It was something one carried quietly within, expressed in patience, kindness, and composure. She also noticed a few whispers from passengers nearby. Some were curious about why she had ended up here instead of in first class. She felt their eyes on her for a moment and smiled faintly. It would have been easy to feel anger, to defend herself or point out the mistake, but she chose not to. Instead, she focused on observing and understanding. Life, she realized, was often more about how one responded than what happened to them. Meal service began and trays clattered as passengers received their food. She watched as a teenage boy struggled with his tray, accidentally dropping a napkin and then trying to balance his plate. Nearby, an older woman laughed quietly, helping the boy adjust the tray. Small acts of cooperation and patience surrounded her, and it reminded her that even in chaos, people could show care for one another. She felt a quiet warmth at the thought. The woman next to her finally spoke, asking about the notebook she carried. They struck up a soft conversation, her neighbor curious about what she was writing. She explained lightly, without revealing too much, about reflections on human behavior, the little ironies of life, and the way ordinary moments could carry meaning. Her companion nodded thoughtfully, impressed by the clarity and calm in her words. It was a reminder that sometimes connection came not from shared status, but from shared understanding and empathy. Time passed and the plane hit turbulence. Drinks shook on trays and some passengers clutched the armrests nervously. She tightened her seatbelt and closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on her breathing. She reminded herself that fear was natural, but it could be managed. Her calm presence seemed to radiate outward, and she noticed that the young child across the aisle, who had been fidgeting nervously, stopped squirming for a moment. Looking curiously at her, she gave the child a small, reassuring smile, and the little one returned it, a tiny moment of human connection amid the bumpiness of the air. During this part of the flight, she also overheard fragments of conversations, business travelers discussing deadlines, families planning their vacations, couples whispering to each other. Each story, she realized, was unfolding quietly and simultaneously. The lives around her were full of hopes, fears, challenges, and joys, none of which were diminished or amplified by the seat they occupied on this plane. She returned to her notebook again, jotting down notes about patience, humility, and understanding. The incident at the counter seemed less important now, replaced by a broader appreciation of human behavior and resilience. She wrote about the small lessons life offered in unexpected ways, about the hidden stories behind every glance, every whisper, every fleeting moment of discomfort. Hours into the journey, the woman next to her mentioned she was traveling to visit her parents, nervous because it was her first solo trip. They talked quietly, sharing small stories and laughing softly at minor mishaps during boarding. It was the kind of conversation that warmed the heart, built on empathy rather than judgment. She realized that while the first-class mistake had been embarrassing, it had opened the door to observing and connecting with people in ways she might not have otherwise. By now, the whispers from passengers had grown louder. Some speculated about her situation, wondering why she had been removed from first class. Some looked with curiosity, others with judgment. She felt their eyes but did not falter. Her quiet composure and the calm in her demeanor seemed to shield her from the growing attention. She realized that dignity was strongest when it was unshakable, when one refused to be defined by the misunderstandings of strangers. The flight continued through the evening. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, creating a calm, warm glow. Passengers began to relax, reading books, watching movies, or talking quietly. She observed all of it with gentle interest, noticing how people adapted to their circumstances, how small gestures of kindness and patience shaped the experience. Her mind wandered briefly to her life outside the plane, to the simplicity she cherished in her daily routines. Despite the chaos and the unexpected displacement, she felt anchored by her own values and perspective. As dinner service ended and the cabin quieted further, she noticed a few passengers still staring. She smiled faintly, a gesture of quiet understanding. There was no need to explain, no need to defend herself. The moment was hers to own quietly, and she did. She observed a young couple laughing over a spilled drink, an older man struggling to adjust his blanket, a mother soothing her baby with soft humming. Each scene reminded her that life's small imperfections were often the most revealing. The hours continued, each minute carrying ordinary events that, when noticed, became remarkable. She wrote more in her notebook, thoughts flowing freely about resilience, patience, and the subtle strength found in ordinary moments. She reflected on the irony of her removal from first class, realizing it had given her a clearer view of humanity than she might have received in comfort and luxury. It was a lesson in empathy, in patience, in observing without judgment. By the time the flight crew began preparing for landing, she felt a sense of completion. The journey, uncomfortable at first, had revealed small truths about human behavior and character. She had learned that humility could be a quiet strength, that grace under pressure left lasting impressions, and that dignity was not something assigned by external circumstances, but cultivated within. She closed her notebook feeling a gentle satisfaction, a quiet pride in the way she had navigated the situation. As the plane descended toward its destination, she straightened her seat, adjusted her bag, and took a deep breath. The landing was smooth, and passengers gathered their belongings. She stood, allowing others to move ahead, and felt a sense of calm. The experience had been humbling, yes, but it had also been illuminating. She had seen patience, kindness, and resilience in action, and she had been reminded that true character often shines brightest in the face of small misunderstandings and everyday chaos. Stepping off the plane, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not because she had been proven right or received an apology, but because she had remained composed, kind, and aware. She walked through the terminal, unbothered by the whispers or the curious glances, carrying with her a deeper understanding of humanity and a reaffirmation of the values she held dear. The day had started with embarrassment and confusion, but it ended with insight and quiet satisfaction, a reminder that even in the smallest challenges, there was much to observe, to learn, and to appreciate. Hours passed quietly in the economy cabin, but the tension of the earlier mistake still lingered in the back of her mind. She had settled into a rhythm now, observing, writing, and reflecting, but she could not ignore the subtle looks and whispers from passengers who were still curious about why a woman like her had been removed from first class. She tried to focus on the ordinary moments, reminding herself that her worth was not tied to a seat on an airplane or the opinions of strangers. Somewhere toward the middle of the flight, an announcement came over the intercom. The voice was calm, professional, and polite, but it carried a weight that immediately drew attention. The passengers quieted down, looking toward the front as the announcement continued. A slight murmur moved through the cabin, a mixture of curiosity and confusion. She tilted her head slightly, wondering what this was about, without giving away any sign that she was paying particular attention. Moments later, a familiar presence entered the cabin. Though at first no one recognized him, he was tall, calm, and carried himself with an air of quiet authority. He walked with purpose toward the front, nodding politely to the crew and a few passengers who glanced his way. There was no rush, no flamboyance, no attempt to draw attention, yet the way he moved made it clear that he was someone of importance. The cabin crew suddenly seemed more tense, more alert, as if aware of a presence that demanded respect. She watched quietly, her curiosity piqued, but her demeanor unchanged. She did not speak, she did not fidget. She remained seated, calm, observing the human dynamics unfolding around her. A few of the crew whispered to each other, their gestures nervous as they hurried to adjust certain elements in the cabin. Something was clearly happening, something beyond the usual flight protocol. Her attention was drawn to a couple of passengers who had been openly staring at her earlier. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to confusion, as if they were beginning to sense that something unusual was afoot. They exchanged glances, whispering quietly, their assumptions starting to crumble. She could not help but notice the change, the subtle shift in perception. It was almost amusing, though she did not smile openly. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. She remained calm as the man continued to walk through the cabin, greeting crew members and checking on certain details. He paused briefly near her row, though not directly at her. She did not react, did not make eye contact. She simply observed, maintaining her quiet dignity. Her heart, however, beat a little faster, an awareness stirring inside her that something significant was about to happen. The crew grew increasingly anxious, moving quickly but efficiently, their polite smiles stretched thin by nerves. She noticed one of the flight attendants fidgeting with a pen, clearly struggling to maintain composure. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted subtly from routine to something charged with unspoken tension. Passengers could feel it too, whispering softly to each other, glancing toward the front of the plane, trying to understand what was happening. Then it happened. A brief conversation between the man and one of the senior flight attendants carried through the aisle, just enough for her to catch a few words. He was clarifying a situation, quietly correcting a misunderstanding. He spoke in calm, measured tones, yet there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. It became clear to the crew almost instantly that they had made a mistake that could have been serious if they had realized sooner. The realization rippled through the cabin, subtle but unmistakable. She remained seated, writing quietly in her notebook, pretending not to notice the unfolding events. Her calm exterior masked a private mixture of amusement and relief. The situation that had begun as embarrassing for her was beginning to transform into something else entirely. Her patience, her composure, and her quiet dignity were about to be acknowledged, though indirectly, by those who had caused her initial discomfort. A few passengers continued to whisper, now casting furtive glances at her as if trying to piece together what they were witnessing. Their curiosity was palpable. They had assumed she was just another traveler, a woman displaced by circumstance. Now uncertainty flickered across their faces. Something about the demeanor of the man at the front, the way the crew reacted, and her calm presence created a puzzle they could not immediately solve. She watched the subtle dance of human behavior around her with a quiet fascination. The crew was moving efficiently, trying to rectify the situation without drawing undue attention. Passengers were curious but polite, waiting to see what would unfold. Through it all, she remained composed, her mind observing the dynamics without judgment. She wrote a few notes reflecting on the way small misunderstandings could reveal character, both of oneself and of others. The man finally reached her row, slowing his pace slightly. She looked up, not directly at him, but enough to catch a glimpse of the calm, authoritative expression on his face. He spoke softly to the flight attendant, a few words exchanged that made her aware of the magnitude of the correction being made. The crew's demeanor shifted again from anxious to respectful, subtle but undeniable. It was a quiet acknowledgement of oversight, of a mistake they had not realized until now. Her neighbor, the woman she had been speaking to intermittently, noticed the change as well. She leaned slightly toward her, whispering, "I think he's important, very important." She nodded, not saying more. The truth of the situation was starting to become clear to those who had been watching, but she said nothing, maintaining her quiet presence. The power of understatement, she thought, was remarkable. The rest of the flight passed with a gentle sense of restoration. The crew moved with greater care around her, offering discreet gestures of acknowledgement without drawing unnecessary attention. Passengers began to relax again, returning to their own activities, though some still glanced curiously in her direction. The dynamics of the cabin had subtly shifted, now tinged with respect rather than judgment or curiosity. She continued to write, reflecting on what had just happened. The incident that had begun as humiliation was transforming into a private lesson about patience, humility, and human perception. She noted how assumptions could be misleading, how appearances often concealed the truth, and how grace under pressure created subtle yet profound impact. She observed quietly, taking mental notes of the way people responded when confronted with authority and correction. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of the man from the front of the cabin. He moved with quiet confidence, checking on small details, speaking softly to crew members, ensuring that everything was in order. His presence was commanding without being ostentatious, a subtle reminder that authority did not always need to be loud or forceful. The passengers who had been whispering earlier now seemed to recognize that some unseen truth was guiding the calm unfolding of events. As the plane began its descent toward the next airport, she reflected on the irony of her situation. She had been removed from first class, judged incorrectly, and yet the very mistake had allowed her to witness a different kind of human story. She had seen anxiety, kindness, curiosity, authority, humility, and the small yet meaningful ways in which people interacted when confronted with unexpected situations. The experience had deepened her understanding of patience and resilience. The landing approached smoothly, the plane descending through a soft layer of clouds. She remained calm, her heart steady, observing the final moments of the flight. Crew members moved efficiently, passengers adjusted their belongings, and the cabin carried the soft hum of activity. The situation that had begun as a minor embarrassment was now transforming into a story of quiet dignity and subtle acknowledgement. Stepping off the plane later, she did so with the same calm composure that had defined her throughout the journey. Passengers still whispered among themselves, now tinged with curiosity rather than judgment. The crew offered polite gestures of respect, acknowledging her without fanfare. She walked through the terminal, carrying her own understanding of patience, humility, and human observation as her quiet reward. She had witnessed something rare, a moment in which authority, misunderstanding, and human behavior intersected in a way that revealed character. She had learned that composure could turn discomfort into insight, that grace could subtly influence those around her, and that patience was often its own form of power. The flight had begun as an ordinary journey, became a moment of embarrassment, and ended as an experience that deepened her understanding of herself and those around her. And through it all, she had remained herself, quiet, observant, and dignified, a simple woman navigating an extraordinary situation with calm, kindness, and insight that no seat class or status could ever define. The flight was nearing its final hours, and the cabin had settled into a calmer rhythm after the previous tension. Passengers were quietly finishing meals, adjusting pillows, and reading or watching videos. She leaned back in her seat, her notebook resting on her lap, and reflected on how much had happened in a short span of time. The incident with the seat had started as a moment of embarrassment, but it had slowly revealed much about human nature, patience, and dignity. Suddenly, the head flight attendant approached her with a slightly nervous smile. "Ma'am, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked politely. She nodded, placing her notebook aside and following the attendant to the end of the row. Her steps were calm, her expression neutral, hiding the mix of curiosity and anticipation that had begun to stir within her. The attendant lowered her voice, speaking with a mix of professionalism and unease. "There was a mistake with your seat. We realize now that you should have been in first class from the start. We are very sorry for the inconvenience." She nodded politely, accepting the apology without any sign of irritation. She had already processed the embarrassment internally and had chosen to handle it with grace. The young woman's words, though sincere, were accompanied by a nervous glance over the shoulder, hinting that the matter was bigger than just a simple seat change. She waited patiently, curious about what was coming next. The attendant stepped aside and the crew began quietly adjusting the cabin. Some passengers looked on, whispering to each other as they tried to understand the sudden flurry of activity. There was a subtle tension now, one that mixed anxiety with anticipation. Everyone seemed to sense that the situation involved more than a typical seat error. She remained calm, observing the reactions quietly, her own presence understated but confident. At that moment, a few of the more observant passengers began to whisper among themselves. The ones who had noticed the calm, authoritative man earlier had begun connecting dots. Their whispers carried curiosity, disbelief, and cautious respect. They glanced at her, trying to piece together the unfolding story. She noticed their glances but remained composed, her attention focused on the ordinary movements and interactions in the cabin rather than the speculation of strangers. The crew continued their preparations, and she noticed a subtle shift in their behavior. The anxiety had transformed into a respectful attentiveness, a quiet acknowledgement of the oversight and the need to correct it properly. There was no grand announcement, no display meant to draw attention, only the careful, deliberate effort to ensure that everything was now in order. She watched, understanding the unspoken weight of responsibility carried by those around her. Her notebook remained open, though her pen paused as she reflected on the dynamics. Small human interactions could reveal far more than appearances ever could. She had seen patience, kindness, and humility displayed by passengers and crew alike. She had seen nervousness and authority intersect in ways that affected everyone around, and through it all, she had remained herself, quiet, observant, and composed. The attendants began moving through the cabin more attentively now, offering gestures of courtesy and subtle apologies to passengers who had been affected. Some of the whispers continued, though now tinged with a growing sense of awareness and respect. A few passengers even offered small smiles or polite nods in her direction, as if recognizing that she had handled the situation with quiet dignity. She acknowledged them with a calm nod, her demeanor steady and unassuming. As the final preparations for landing began, a small group of crew members approached her gently, indicating that she could now return to first class if she wished. She looked at them thoughtfully, considering the offer. Her initial embarrassment had long since passed, replaced by reflection and understanding. Accepting the seat was an option, but she realized that the lesson she had learned in economy, the quiet strength of patience and observation, was just as valuable, perhaps even more so than the comfort of first-class luxury. She rose gracefully and followed the attendants, walking slowly and deliberately toward the front of the cabin. Passengers moved aside politely, some still whispering, some watching with curiosity. There was no fanfare, no spectacle, only a quiet acknowledgement of a mistake corrected. She remained composed, her expression neutral, her steps measured. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of understanding, patience, and dignity. As she approached her first-class seat, she noticed the careful preparation that had been made. Everything was in order, a subtle recognition of the initial error. She sat down, adjusting her belongings with calm precision. The attendants offered gentle assistance, their nervousness replaced by respectful efficiency. She thanked them quietly, her tone warm but understated. The atmosphere around her shifted slightly, passengers and crew alike recognizing, if only subconsciously, that this was a woman who had carried herself with grace through an uncomfortable situation. Once seated, she took a moment to observe the cabin. There was a new sense of calm, a soft energy that came from resolution and quiet understanding. She reflected on the irony of the day, how a simple mistake had become an experience rich with insight. She thought about the human stories she had witnessed, the young child, the nervous traveler, the patient crew, the subtle authority of the man who had overseen the correction. Each had contributed to a tapestry of human behavior that she now carried with her. She reached for her notebook again, jotting down thoughts about observation, patience, and quiet dignity. The experience had reinforced her belief that true strength lay in how one responded to discomfort, in the ability to maintain composure, empathy, and kindness regardless of external circumstances. She wrote about the subtle power of understatement, the way calm presence could influence those around her, and the lasting impact of patience in moments of challenge. Passengers nearby began settling in, some watching her discreetly, others returning to their own routines. There was a subtle acknowledgement in the cabin, a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. She observed it with gentle interest, appreciating the human tendency to notice character, even when it was not explicitly displayed. It was a small yet profound moment of understanding. The flight attendants continued their duties with renewed efficiency, now moving with calm confidence rather than anxious haste. A few approached to offer refreshments, polite smiles acknowledging both their professionalism and the subtle correction that had taken place. She accepted politely, maintaining her calm demeanor. Each interaction reinforced her quiet sense of dignity, the reward of composure and patience in a world often quick to judge. Time passed, and the plane prepared for landing. She observed the gentle hum of activity around her, the soft conversations, the careful adjustments of passengers, the subtle coordination of the crew. The cabin had transformed from tension and curiosity to calm, respect, and quiet order. She reflected on the transformation, considering how small gestures, subtle observations, and composed responses could ripple through a group of people, influencing attitudes and behaviors in ways that were not immediately visible. As the plane descended, she felt a quiet sense of completion. The journey that had begun with embarrassment and discomfort was ending with insight, understanding, and subtle acknowledgement. She had witnessed human behavior at its most genuine: curiosity, fear, patience, kindness, and respect. She had observed authority exercised with calm assurance and learned that true dignity was carried inward, revealed in quiet actions and composure rather than outward display. Once the plane touched down and passengers began to gather their belongings, she remained calm, allowing the flow of activity around her. Crew members moved efficiently, passengers adjusted themselves, and whispers persisted, though now tinged with respect rather than judgment. She walked steadily, carrying her own sense of accomplishment and understanding. The journey had provided lessons that would stay with her long after she had left the cabin. As she stepped off the plane, she felt the cool air of the terminal and the subtle energy of people moving around her. She moved with quiet confidence, her steps deliberate and her posture calm. The small gestures of respect, the subtle acknowledgement of patience and composure were her reward. She carried herself as she always had, quietly observant, thoughtful, and dignified, having navigated an extraordinary situation with calm, empathy, and insight. The experience had revealed much about human behavior, about patience, humility, and quiet strength. It had shown her that embarrassment could be transformed into insight, that mistakes could become lessons, and that dignity was something that could never be taken by circumstance or judgment. As she moved through the terminal, she reflected on these truths, feeling a quiet satisfaction that was more valuable than any first-class luxury. As she settled into the first-class seat, a sense of calm washed over her. The journey that had begun with confusion and embarrassment had slowly transformed into something remarkable. She looked around, observing the cabin with quiet curiosity. The crew moved efficiently, passengers adjusted, and a subtle hum of conversation filled the space. Everything seemed ordinary, yet for her the ordinary had taken on a deeper meaning. She adjusted her bag and placed her notebook on the tray table. Her pen hovered for a moment as she reflected on the flight, thinking about how patience, observation, and quiet composure had shaped the experience. She could have reacted with anger, frustration, or defensiveness when she was removed from her seat. But instead, she had chosen calmness and dignity. And now, as she sat in first class, she realized that the journey had been more about what she had learned than about the seat itself. Passengers nearby were chatting softly, some still glancing her way. There was curiosity in their eyes, a subtle recognition that she had carried herself with grace. Some of them whispered to each other, clearly piecing together the events that had unfolded earlier in the flight. She smiled faintly, a small gesture that carried warmth without drawing attention. She did not need to explain herself. The moment was hers to own quietly. Her mind wandered to the man she had glimpsed earlier, the one who had moved through the cabin with quiet authority. His presence had brought a subtle order and calm to the crew, and now she realized the truth of the situation. He had overseen the correction of the mistake with a quiet authority that required no display of power. She marveled at the way human behavior and observation intertwined, revealing truths that were often hidden beneath assumptions and appearances. The flight attendants moved closer to ensure everything was in order. One offered her a beverage, which she accepted politely, and another adjusted her seat, ensuring she was comfortable. Their gestures were professional, yet there was a subtle respect in the way they handled her. She noted this in her mind, appreciating the small ways that kindness and acknowledgement could communicate more than words ever could. As the flight continued, she reflected on the ordinary moments that had become extraordinary through observation. She had seen patience and understanding in fellow passengers, kindness in the crew, and composure in herself. Every small interaction had contributed to a tapestry of human behavior, and she realized that her experience was a microcosm of life itself. People were constantly navigating challenges, misunderstandings, and small moments of discomfort, and how they responded defined much of the human experience. She looked out the window, watching the clouds drift past, and thought about how life was often like this flight. Sometimes turbulence came unexpectedly, plans changed, and people faced discomfort without warning. But patience, observation, and grace could turn a challenging situation into a meaningful experience. She had learned that humility and quiet composure were as important as any luxury or recognition. Her neighbor in first class, a middle-aged woman who had been watching her with gentle curiosity, finally spoke. "You handled everything so calmly earlier. I don't know how I would have managed that." She smiled softly, "Thank you. It wasn't always easy, but I tried to remain composed." The woman nodded thoughtfully, and a brief, warm connection passed between them. Small moments like these, she realized, carried more weight than grand gestures or displays of wealth. The crew continued their service with precision, but now there was a subtle shift. They moved with a quiet attentiveness, a recognition that their earlier mistake had been corrected with grace. Some passengers glanced her way, curiosity giving way to respect. She remained understated, observing without judgment, noting the human reactions that played out subtly around her. As the plane began to descend, she reflected on the lessons of the day. The initial embarrassment had been transformed into insight, the mistake into an opportunity to witness human behavior in its authentic form. She wrote a few final notes in her notebook, capturing reflections on patience, dignity, humility, and quiet influence. She understood that true respect was not demanded but earned through consistent composure and understanding. The landing was smooth, and the plane taxied to the gate. Passengers began gathering their belongings, moving toward the exit with quiet anticipation. She remained calm, observing the movements around her, appreciating the ordinary human choreography of travel. Crew members moved efficiently, offering polite gestures and smiles, their earlier anxiety replaced by quiet professionalism and subtle acknowledgement. As she stood, she adjusted her bag and followed the flow of passengers toward the terminal. The whispers and curious glances continued, though now mixed with respect and intrigue. She smiled faintly at a few, acknowledging them with quiet grace, but did not speak. The situation had revealed much about human nature, and she carried that understanding with her as a private reward for her composure and patience. Once in the terminal, she moved with deliberate calm, observing the bustling crowd around her. Travelers hurried past, families reunited, and workers moved with efficiency. She felt a sense of connection to the human flow, recognizing the shared experiences of discomfort, patience, and quiet achievement that defined so many lives. Her own journey, though small in the larger context, had offered profound insight. Her mind wandered back to her husband, whose presence had subtly influenced the cabin without overt display. She appreciated the quiet authority he wielded, the way he oversaw situations and allowed resolution to occur naturally. She understood that power did not need to be loud or commanding. Sometimes the simplest presence combined with awareness and patience was enough to guide events toward order and understanding. Passengers around her continued their routines, some noticing her composure, some absorbed in their own affairs. She moved with subtle confidence, recognizing that dignity was not about recognition or display, but about how one carried oneself in every moment. The lessons from the flight were clear. Patience, humility, observation, and quiet composure could influence circumstances and people more profoundly than any seat class or outward display of status. She paused near the exit, taking a final moment to observe the people around her. Families greeted each other, friends shared laughter, and travelers navigated the practicalities of arrival. Each small moment, ordinary on its surface, carried the weight of human experience, and she appreciated it fully. She understood that the story of her flight would remain private, a reflection of how grace, patience, and understanding could transform even uncomfortable experiences into meaningful lessons. Walking toward the baggage claim, she reflected on the irony and subtle humor of her journey. She had been removed from first class, judged incorrectly, and yet the experience had revealed more about humanity than any seat assignment ever could. The whispers of passengers, the subtle reactions of the crew, and the quiet authority of the man who had corrected the mistake had all contributed to a private revelation about dignity and composure. At the baggage area, she waited patiently for her luggage, observing the efficiency and interactions of those around her. Travelers moved with purpose, some irritated by delays, others chatting softly. She remained calm, appreciating the shared human experience of waiting and navigating small challenges. The lesson of patience, quiet observation, and composure applied not only to the flight but to this moment as well. When her luggage finally appeared, she retrieved it calmly, adjusting the straps and checking that everything was in order. She walked toward the exit, feeling a sense of closure. The journey had started with embarrassment and confusion, progressed through reflection and observation, and ended with insight, composure, and quiet satisfaction. She had experienced the full range of human behavior and response in a condensed, extraordinary moment, and she carried those lessons with her. As she stepped out of the terminal into the sunlight, she felt a sense of freedom and understanding. The world around her continued, bustling and vibrant, indifferent to the small dramas that unfolded within it. She smiled softly, acknowledging the lessons she had learned, the patience she had cultivated, and the dignity she had maintained. Her journey, though ordinary on the surface, had revealed extraordinary truths about humanity, patience, and the quiet strength of character. She walked steadily toward the exit, blending into the crowd but carrying with her a subtle power that came from experience and understanding. The whispers, glances, and small gestures of acknowledgement would remain in the memories of those who had observed her. But for her, the true reward was private, a deepened awareness of patience, dignity, and the quiet ways in which humans influenced one another. The story of the flight, her removal from first class, and the unexpected lessons learned would remain a part of her, guiding her through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that lay ahead.